Hello and welcome to Unit 3, Slavery in Early America. So previously we've talked about how slavery began in Africa, how they got the slaves, how they kidnapped the slaves, how they got them to the slave forts where they were to sell them, and then we talked about the Middle Passage on how the slaves got from Africa to the Americas. Now we're going to talk about what life was like once they arrived. So, colonial America, right? So at this time, we have our early colonies settling America. We only have the coast of America. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So it's not very developed. Okay, so we're just starting the idea of slavery. So first you have the Native Americans there. And they tried to get the Native Americans to be servants for them, but they really wanted nothing to do with the whites, and the whites brought diseases, and they were constantly warring with them. So it was not something that worked out real well. But they had indentured servants. So what happens with these is, we talked earlier this week about how in England, there's no free land, right? You couldn't become a landowner if you were not like nobility and it was gifted to you. All the land was gone. Okay. Well, in colonial America, there's land. You can get land for a very low price. You can start over. You can, the sky's the limit what you can do. And so what would happen is you'd have people that were really poor that wanted to go to America to have a better life. And so what they would do is they would approach a nobleman that's going to the Americas and say, hey, here's the deal. I'll sign a contract with you and I will work for you for 2 to 7 years, depending on the cost, if you pay for the voyage, housing, and food for me. All right. And so the nobleman would pay for the indentured servant to come over, and the nobleman would have the indentured servant work for them. But the problem with that is there's two problems. One, your indentured servant eventually gets freed. Okay. When they get freed, you give them a little bit of money, give them some clothes, have a nice day. Right. Well, once your indentured servant is free, what do? The other problem is they could run away. Right? It's really easy for them to run away, and then nobody would know that they came to the Americas as an indentured servant. So if you happen to get a really horrible person that you leased yourself to, you'd escape, right? And what you would do is you'd travel, right? And you would blend in with that group of people. So here's something to think about, okay? So I live in Hendersonville, right? And in Hendersonville, there's this place called Rock Castle. Okay, Rock Castle used to be a plantation. It had slaves on it. All right. And then in Hermitage, you have Andrew Jackson's home, right? And that was also another plantation. Okay, so to travel from Rock Castle in Hendersonville to the Hermitage, it took about half a day travel, right? And like that takes us like 20 minutes now, right? So if an indentured servant was to travel a couple of days, they would get far enough away from their original owner and they could blend in with whatever town they were in. Nobody would know that they were indentured servants, so they could run away super easily. So your indentured servants, their servitude ends or they run away. So what do? They bring in slaves. Okay. The first slaves were in 1619 and they went to Jamestown. The reason that they liked slaves in the Americas is because they were African American. They looked different, right? So they were able to stand out. If they were to run away, people would notice and they would return them because they would know that the majority of African Americans are not freed. And if they were, they're going to have paperwork. Right? In the 1620s to 1670s, there's not a lot of strict laws on how to govern slavery at the time, like how they were to be sold, who If you had children, who would they go to? So it was just kind of a free-for-all, whatever you think works. Okay, so let's talk about how they were imported. They were considered black gold. Okay, so here's the deal. Check this out. Use my little pointer here. So, Royal African Company of 1672. Okay, they're the ones that were selling slaves, right? This was owned by King George III of England. Okay, so the royalty got in on this and they were making money. So in Africa, they could buy a slave for $25, right? And then in America, they could sell that slave for $150. So they were able to make an incredible amount by buying slaves and reselling them in the Americas. So they're considered black gold because you can make a lot of money in the slave trade. All right. And that price just gets, grows. So we've got 1671, 5%, but in the 1700s, it's like a 20% increase. So let's talk about American slavery. It is where you start getting that chattel slavery. And we talked about chattel slavery, right? Chattel slavery is the slaves are considered property, right? And when you purchase property, you get something, right? You get a receipt. You get, in this case, they call it a bill of sale, all right? And it says that the slave cost this amount of money, belongs to this owner. Okay, so you have proof that says that you own this slave. A lot of times the bill of sale will also include distinguishing marks, right? So if they had a scar, it would mention the scar, that kind of thing. They also exploited the females. I mentioned this in an earlier flip video, but they would purchase females for breeding, right? So if they can produce their own slaves, it would be a lot cheaper labor than it would be if they had to go buy a slave, right? So the females cost less, okay? So the return on your money, it takes a little bit of time. It takes about, 13, 14 years before you can really get work out of a slave. So females cost less, and then you get a free slave if you can get them to breed. So, House of Burgesses in Virginia. Okay, so this is where we start seeing some slave laws, all right, that says who belongs to who and how they can be sold and all that kind of stuff. So we start seeing slave laws in the Americas, all right? And so House of Burgesses is the governing body in Virginia at the time. And this is what they said. The status of the African child is determined by the mother's status, okay? So we start seeing white owners take advantage of their black slaves, okay? And they would get their black slaves pregnant, okay? And so there was a debate because the father's white and the mother's not. Is this child born slave or free? Okay? Well, prior to this law, it went with the father's status, so that it would be born free. Well, this law changed things, okay? And it says if the child is born is mixed, it goes with the mother's status, okay? So an example would be Thomas Jefferson, American president. He had a whole nother family with an African American, okay? And so all of the children that he had with her were born into slavery. What this allowed for was the exploitation of females. So like I was telling you, it allowed for things like breeding of females so that they can get free slaves. So the colonies, they're split up into three regions, right? You have the northern colonies. They are these ones right up here. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Okay. And they did a lot of slave trading. So we were talking about the slaves in the family that we learned about, the Traces of the Trade, A Story of the Deep North, right? That family lived in this area up here, and they were slave traders, right? And they made a lot of money on the trade. Okay, middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Okay, and Delaware is in here too. All right, so these colonies, they didn't have the same number of slaves, but they did have slaves, and they were used for things like domestic services. So more like you'd have like one or two slaves. One of them would be a house slave. One of them would take care of the horses, that kind of thing. So you weren't having like heavy labor. Now you have the southern colonies all down here. They were the ones that did plantation slavery. Okay, so let's look at what that looks like. Plantation slavery is in the South. Okay, they grew things like tobacco, rice, and indigo. So let's talk about this indigo stuff. Indigo is used as a dye. Okay, it's this beautiful blue dye. And dyes back then in fabrics were considered a sign of status. So if you had fabric made with this indigo dye, you were very wealthy because it was expensive. Okay, so the people that grew indigo made a lot of money. Okay, now the most profitable crop to export is the tobacco. Okay, the tobacco is light, it's easy to grow, and it's grown in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and North Carolina. Okay, so with this, you see the creation of larger farms. We're starting to see the creation of plantations. So we're planting now to make money instead of for substance, right? So the tobacco is something that's called a cash crop. It's a crop that you grow specifically to make money off of. Okay, and as a result, the amount of slaves that were imported went dramatically up as the farms grew. So in 1700, you had approximately 80,000 slaves. 1750, it went up to 140,000 slaves in just 2 states. Okay, so let's talk about King Cotton. Okay, so cotton becomes a huge export, right? And it looks like this plant up here. And see this white right here? That's the cotton. Here's the challenge with growing cotton. Okay, so cotton has seeds in it, all right? And so the slaves would, there's the cotton right there. The slaves would pick that white tuft off and have to go through it to pull out the seeds, okay? Very labor intensive. So it slowed down the production of it. Well, Eli Whitney creates this thing called the cotton gin, and it is a machine that takes the seeds out of the cotton. Okay, and so this creates cotton becoming a leading export in the 1790s. The problem is, you would think that it would reduce the slave labor. It didn't. It actually made it grow. So because they were able to produce cotton faster, they wanted to produce more of it. And so what they did was they grew their farms. All right. So they made even bigger plantations. And cotton became such a big thing that it became a status symbol. King Cotton became a way of life. So let's talk about a famous slave from that period. Actually, we're going to go over this in class. Her name is Phillis Wheatley. Okay, she's from Gambia, and she was a slave for 7 or 8 years. And she was a slave of John Wheatley, a tailor from Boston, Massachusetts, and she was educated. Okay, so she's best known as a New England poet. She had many firsts, and she traveled. She met George Washington, and she was freed in 1773. So Phillis Wheatley wrote some poems that we're going to take a look at.